Last month, I introduced bipartisan legislation with Senator Todd Young of Indiana to create greater transparency about foreign individuals and organizations that are operating in the United States to advance the interests of foreign governments, including governments that are hostile to the United States. In particular, our bill will give the Department of Justice new and necessary authority to investigate potential violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act by RT America, the U.S. branch of RT News, or Russia Today News. The Foreign Agents Registration Act was passed back in the late 1930s in response to concerns about Nazi propaganda being disseminated in the United States without people knowing what it was. Well, this, I think, is absolutely appropriate today for us to take a look at what Russia and other countries may be doing to our news. RT America, which broadcasts from studios here in Washington and is available on cable TV across the United States and across the world for that matter, is one of the most high-profile assets in Vladimir Putin's vast $1.4 billion propaganda machine. According to the U.S. intelligence community, the Kremlin selects the staff for RT and closely supervises RT's coverage, including disinformation and false news stories designed to undermine our democracy. So here we have a photo that shows exactly what I believe seems to be happening with RT. This photo is taken from a declassified U.S. intelligence report, and it shows RT editor-in-chief and former Putin campaign staffer, by the way, Margarita Simoyan, briefing Putin on RT's facilities. So he clearly is interested. Well, I believe the American people have a right to know if a Russian government entity is exploiting our First Amendment freedoms to harm our country. And it's galling that RT News has publicly boasted that it can dodge our laws by claiming to be financed by a nonprofit organization and not the Russian government. Well, what our bill would do is strengthen the Foreign Agents Registration Act by giving the Department of Justice authority to compel foreign organizations to produce documentation to confirm funding sources and foreign connections. Now, this is investigative authority that has been recommended by the Department of Justice Inspector General, the Government Accountability Office, and the Project on Government Oversight. Our bill would create transparency by giving justice the authority it needs to investigate RT America and publicly expose its ties to the Kremlin. The audacity of Russia's interference in Western democracies, including extensive meddling in our 2016 presidential election, is deeply alarming. And we've learned that Russia's influence campaign reaches tens of millions of unsuspecting Americans. False news stories can end up on our Facebook timelines, our Twitter feeds. They shape the political conversations that we have with our friends at the supermarket and our colleagues at work. We know that Russia interfered in our 2016 presidential election, and we know that the Russian influence campaign was one aspect of that influence. Our intelligence community has concluded that RT America is an arm of the Russian propaganda juggernaut, operating openly in our country and taking full advantage of our First Amendment freedoms. Now, I'm sure we would all agree that everyone in the United States and every organization has a right to speak, write, and broadcast freely. That's what our First Amendment says. And we're a resilient democracy. We're confident that our values and institutions will prevail in the free marketplace of ideas. Our Constitution protects the right of individuals and organizations to spread those Russian viewpoints, disinformation, and even outright lies. But the American people have a right to know if RT America is a Russian propaganda organ that takes its direction from the Kremlin. They have a right to know who's funding their operations. RT has publicly boasted that it uses a shell nonprofit corporation to dodge U.S. laws. And this legislation The Foreign Agents Registration, Modernization and Enforcement Act would put an end to this charade. So the legislation that Senator Young and I have introduced recently. It would give the Department of Justice the authority it needs to request documentation from RT News on funding sources and foreign connections. And as we see here, clearly the legislation has hit a nerve because Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov defended RT News, and Russia's State Duma is considering measures to retaliate. And see, what RT says about our legislation is that we want to probe RT as a foreign agent. What's next? Public executions. Well, that's ridiculous. The editor-in-chief at RT News has said that my legislation is a quote-unquote persecution of dissenting voices. As I said, that's just nonsense. I welcome dissenting voices. That's what our First Amendment in the United States is all about. But it's not reasonable or acceptable for an individual or organization working in the U.S. on behalf of a hostile foreign government to conceal funding and direction that it receives from that government. Vladimir Putin is not going to stop us from enforcing our laws and protecting our country. We have a responsibility to expose RT News, RT America, and the entire panoply of tactics that Russia has used to interfere in our 2016 election and that they continue to currently use to sow confusion and distrust and spread around news that is not stories that pretend to be news that are not accurate. Make no mistake, the Kremlin's influence campaign is an ongoing enterprise, and to the extent that it is successful, that it can operate under the radar screen, it will become even more brazen and more aggressive in the future. In testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee last December, Dr. Robert Kagan of the Brookings Institution said that Russia's broader objective is to subvert Western democracies, and we see that going on now in Europe. He said for the United States to ignore this Russian tactic, particularly now that it has been deployed against the United States, is to cede to Moscow a powerful tool of modern geopolitical warfare. That was a direct quote. This is a profound test for our country. Our democracy has been attacked and continues to be under attack from this kind of news that is being put out by a Kremlin-funded organization who is a hostile foreign power. We need to understand the Kremlin's tactics, and we need to expose this propaganda here in the United States, including RT America. So to that end, I urge my colleagues to support the Foreign Agents Registration, Modernization, and Enforcement Act, and let's give the Department of Justice the tools it needs to investigate and expose RT America. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.